Hey, fifth grade, this is part 2 of chapter 9. If you have not watched part 1 yet, close this out and go watch that first. Finally, she offered an image of a little door the cats used to go in and out. A door just wide enough for a small dragon, if it folded its wings tightly against its sides. Go home, thought Jeremy, sending her an image of herself returning through the little door. Tiamat's response felt like a frown inside his head. She didn't want to go home. He felt bad, and he needed her here. I feel fine, insisted Jeremy, but it's hard to lie when you're communicating with thoughts instead of words. He didn't feel fine, and they both knew it, so Tiamat stayed. As if things weren't bad enough, Mary Lou showed up next. She's here, she cried in delight. Jeremy nodded. How come the others don't see her? Jeremy shrugged. There's a lot about dragons I haven't figured out. Tiamat sent him a little wave of smugness. To his enormous relief, Mr. Siegel waved his hand to announce it was time to go back inside. They started toward the door, Jeremy hanging back a little so that no one would accidentally touch Tiamat. Go home, he urged again, as the line approached the school. Tiamat refused. Jeremy trudged into the building, carrying the dragon on his shoulder. In the classroom, Tiamat slithered down Jeremy's arm, crawled under his desk, and curled up at his feet. She lay there, snoozing contentedly, while he worked on his math test. He was glad she had consumed all her milk that morning. He had given it to her in a mixing bowl now, and she was gulping down at least a quart at a time. Jeremy frowned. His parents were already wondering where all the milk was going. Before long, he would have to start buying it out of his allowance. I suppose it's worth it to keep her calm, he thought. He checked under his desk. She raised her head and gave him a dreamy dragon smile. He smiled back. They had made it through the first half hour without any trouble. And her presence actually had helped to calm him down. That was partly out of the necessity. If he didn't force himself to be calm, who knew what Tiamat might do? He finished his test and looked around. Mary Lou was staring at him. When she saw him look at her, she blushed and smiled. What the heck, he thought, and smiled back. Her blush deepened to crimson, and she turned away. Jeremy was surprised. Maybe he wasn't powerless against Mary Lou after all. I wonder what would happen if I sent her a note saying I wanted to kiss her. Would she run away and leave me alone for good? He shook his head. What if she took him seriously? The risk definitely was not worth it. As Mr. Siegel was collecting the tests, someone knocked at the door. Before anyone could get up, the door swung open. Mr. Kravitz stepped in. Jeremy's reaction to the man woke Tiamat, who poked her head out from under the desk. I've come to discuss the spring art contest, said Mr. Kravitz. Jeremy's interest perked up. This was what he had been waiting for. As you know, the contest is sponsored by the Downtown Merchants Association. They want things they can use to decorate the storefronts. As always, the grand winner gets to paint the giant window at Zambrino's department store. You're all invited to enter, but I don't want to see anything but your best work. This contest is going to represent the school, and I want us to look good. That made sense, but true to his fashion, excuse me, Mr. Kravitz managed to say it in a way that made it seem very insulting. As the man talked, Jeremy found himself getting angrier and angrier. He knew it was a bad idea, but he couldn't help himself. It wasn't until he saw Tiamat slinking down the aisle that he realized what a major mistake it was to let his emotions get out of hand. Tiamat, he thought desperately, get back here. Since he forgot to frame the command in pictures, the dragon ignored him. He searched for an image, then sent a picture of Tiamat crawling back under his desk. She responded with a picture of Mr. Kravitz hopping around on one foot. Jeremy's heart began to pound. What are you up to? No answer. Mr. Kravitz launched into a lecture on his standards for entries he was willing to submit to the Merchants Association. I don't want any of this green sky and pink grass stuff that some of you like to do, he said. Jeremy heard Mary Lou gasp as Tiamat reached the front of the room and crouched beside Mr. Kravitz's left foot. After all, continued the art teacher, I'm not going to have the people in this town thinking I haven't taught you anything about color. Jeremy, watching Tiamat warily, doubted that anyone would believe a sixth grader who colored grass pink was doing anything but having fun. And I don't want any of this fantasy stuff, continued Mr. Kravitz as Tiamat began to breathe on his foot. No dragons or nonsense like that. Yeah, let's not use our imaginations, thought Jeremy bitterly. But this time he was too fed up with Mr. Kravitz. He didn't really care what Tiamat did. He watched her ribs rise and fall as she puffed on the art teacher's foot. And another thing, said Mr. Kravitz. He was starting to look uncomfortable now, and he lifted his foot to rub it against the back of his trousers. I want you to... Suddenly he bent down and stared at his shoe. Tiamat gave another puff, and it started to smoke. Mr. Kravitz tore off the shoe and began hopping around on one foot. Ow! He cried. Ow, ow, ow. It was just like the image Tiamat had sent to Jeremy. He could sense her smugness as she slithered back to his desk. He had to bite down on the corners of his mouth to kill his laughter. Mr. Siegel jumped up and stared at Mr. Kravitz, who started forward, then stopped as if he couldn't figure out what to do. Mr. Kravitz stared at his shoe in puzzlement. Most of the kids sat in wide-eyed astonishment. Given the art teacher's temper, Jeremy knew this was the safest reaction. Even so, from here and there around the room, he could hear little snorts of laughter. Mary Lou, the only kid besides Jeremy who knew what had really happened, had her hands over her mouth. Mr. Kravitz glared at the offenders. I do not find this very amusing, he shouted. He examined his shoe carefully, searching for signs of tampering. I want to know who did this, he said, and I want to know now. When no one answered, Mr. Kravitz grew even angrier. That does it, he roared. Until the coward who did this confess, Room 19 is banned from the art contest. Tucking his scorched shoe under his arm, he stormed out of the room, giving the door a wall-rattling slam as he left. The class breathed out together as if on some kind of signal. Can he really do that? Asked Specimen, his voice trembling. Do what? Asked Mr. Siegel. Ban us from the art contest. The teacher frowned. Probably. The look on Specimen's face twisted Jeremy's stomach. Tiamat sent the question feeling, but Jeremy didn't know how to respond. The whole problem seemed too complicated to put into images. An hour ago, he and Specimen had seemed like sure winners. Now, in order for either of them to enter the contest, he, Jeremy, would have to confess to something he hadn't done, and confess it to the man he disliked most in the whole world.